Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, the Health, Medicine, and Bioscience edition. It's my job to find the experts, the geniuses in their fields, and interview them. I've spoken to well over 2,000 people the past 3.5 years, and today my guest is Lawrence Kirschner. He's a physician and a scientist. He's kind of in both worlds, a clinical endocrinologist. He has more than 20 years experience, and he has experience treating people with pituitary and adrenal tumors, including adrenal cancer and another type of cancer I can't pronounce right now. But glad to have him. Lawrence, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. It's nice to be with you today.
Yeah, I think it's cool that you're both a physician and a scientist. It seems rare. People seem to stick to their knitting. Well, any comments on that? Like, why have you made why do you straddle both worlds, and why don't a lot of people do that?
Well, I can only tell you from my experience that I love having a foot in both worlds. You know, I've always been an active scientist, really interested in research and trying to figure things out. But you know, the clinical side really adds a lot to it because it lets me see the kind of problems that real world people face, and it, I think, really helps focus my science and thinking about, you know, what can we do that may eventually have some impact in the clinic. You know, to answer your question about how common is this, it's not that common. It's, you know, I think it's the number of physician scientists is getting squeezed a little bit by the needs of both, you know, the clinical environment and the research environment. But there's still a small and dedicated group of us that really love to do this.
Well, when you're a physician and a scientist, I mean, you know, most scientists, they're attached to universities, you know, other organizations. Do you get funding from NIH and places like that, or do you have to self-fund your research?
No, the funding is similar to other PhD scientists. It's primarily NIH funding. Sometimes some foundations will chip in as well, but the NIH is the big source.
And okay, and then the research that you're doing, well, let's talk about what do you do on the clinical side right now, and then what's your research about?
So on the clinical side, I'm a clinical endocrinologist, as you mentioned, and I'm really a subspecialist focusing on diseases of the pituitary and really mostly the adrenal glands. So that involves patients that have tumors of the adrenal gland of different types, both adrenal cortical cancer and benign tumors, as well as other type of tumor, which you couldn't pronounce, which is called a pheochromocytoma, which is an adrenaline-secreting tumor. And then I also see patients that have inherited diseases that affect primarily the adrenal glands. A number of tumor syndromes are like that, and I specialize in that.
So what kind of diseases affect, again, people adrenally? You know, has it been figured out how and why, and what are the precursors to people having adrenal disease? And what are some of them? So
I tend to think of them as sort of two different categories: those that have adrenal overfunction and those that have adrenal underfunction, or adrenal insufficiency, as we say. And it's really been an interesting field to be in over the last 20 years, 25 years. The most common cause of adrenal insufficiency is a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and that's been known about for a long time, and the genetics of that have been well worked out. But there's been a number of other conditions that have been really discovered or understood over the last maybe 10, 15 years that also cause the adrenal glands not to function normally. And on the other side, adrenal tumors that secrete hormones is really sort of a different and fascinating area of research. And again, the understanding of the genetics of these adrenal tumors is just increased by leaps and bounds over the time that I've been really doing this.
Do adrenal cancers and adrenal conditions correlate with, dysfunction in other organs, and, are they common?
So adrenal cancers are fortunately very rare because they're very difficult to treat. They can be associated with other types of tumors, but most of the time adrenal cancers just come sporadically. They're not inherited in any way.
Do any adrenal conditions seem to correlate with dysfunction in other organs?
So
body that seems to go hand in hand with the adrenals.
I guess the way I would answer that is adrenal tumors that secrete hormones can have a lot of significant effects. So the most common hormones that we see from these adrenal tumors are the most common one is probably cortisol, which is a type of steroid hormone like prednisone or something like that. And patients that have tumors that secrete cortisol can have a lot of problems. So it's a hormone that causes people to gain a lot of weight. It causes diabetes and high blood pressure. It also can cause osteoporosis, so people get fragile bones and a fragile skin as well. So people that have this condition, excess cortisol or Cushing syndrome, have a lot of systemic medical issues related to just the hormone part of it.
Okay. So of the common conditions you see, are they very treatable, barely treatable? What are a few examples?
So adrenal cancer is not particularly treatable. That's one of the ones that we struggle a lot. It's tends to be a very aggressive cancer. A lot of the other things are much more treatable. So the much more common thing that we see are benign adrenal tumors that either make hormones or don't make hormones. And the ones that don't make hormones, actually, we just tend to leave them alone. They're just sit there not doing much. The ones that make hormones, either we take them out surgically, or sometimes we actually have, meaning the medical community, has developed over the past number of years a number of treatments that are specific for different hormones. So depending on what hormone is being produced in excess, there's probably a medicine that can be used either to prevent the adrenal gland from making the hormone or to block the action of the hormone.
Yeah, you mentioned there's cortisol-producing tumors. What are the other substances that can get produced by the hormone?
Yeah, so there's another hormone made by the adrenal gland called aldosterone, which is a blood pressure hormone. So people that have that type of tumor will have high blood pressure, often associated with low potassium as well. And that we can treat medically if surgery is not the right approach. And then occasionally we'll see adrenal tumors that make testosterone or the male hormones. And those can be very problematic, particularly in women, obviously. And then as I mentioned earlier, the adrenaline secreting tumors, and those are sort of a whole different challenge.
What happens if the tumor produces a lot of adrenaline? What will the person experience?
Yeah, so adrenaline, as you may know, is the fight or flight hormone. So these tumors that produce adrenaline typically cause a bunch of different things. They cause headaches. They cause sort of sweating and shaking. They do cause high blood pressure usually, and heart palpitations are very common as well. And anxiety as a kind of overall feature that the patient's experiences are very common. Those things.
Okay, and then what happens in your research? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so my research is related, but not directly related to the patients that I see. My research is focused on understanding the genetics of endocrine tumors. So we started out by studying a number of genes that cause these very rare inherited tumor syndromes that involve endocrine organs, typically the adrenal gland, but not exclusively. And the thrust of my research is really to understand how these genes, which we know cause tumors in people, how they actually work, how they cause excess cell proliferation, or overgrowth or unregulated growth, or sometimes we also try to understand how they cause excess hormone secretion rather.
Okay, so what have you discovered so far?
Yeah, so my work originated with studying a very rare tumor syndrome called Kearny complex, named for Dr. Kearny, who's a pathologist at the Mayo Clinic, who sort of put this rare group of tumors together. And I discovered a number of years ago that this was caused by a gene called PRKAR1A, which is a very long name. We call it R1A, much easier to say that. And this gene functions in a key signaling pathway, which affects all cells, called the cyclic AMP protein kinase A signaling pathway. And that pathway is conserved in people all the way down to early bacteria. So it's really one of these fundamental pathways of understanding how a cell interacts with its environment. We know that's important in endocrine tissues because endocrine hormones are one of the ways that cells communicate with each other within the body. And so we've been really trying to tease out, when you dysregulate this pathway, how that contributes to tumor formation. And we found a number of other pathways that are regulated or appear to interact at least with this protein kinase A pathway and promote cell growth.
So is there, what's different or significant about adrenal-based tumors? In terms of the cancer mechanisms and effects, are they very different from other cancers or pretty similar? It's just they have different oncogenes that cause them, or have you seen again that it's very different or kind of similar?
They're a pretty unique set of cancers. Some of the genes that we've seen in endocrine in adrenal cancers relate to the beta-catenin pathway, which is another pathway that's actually activated in a number of other tumors, such as colon cancer, for example. But there's a number of other genes that interact with the beta-catenin pathway that seem to be somewhat unique for adrenal cancers. And then there's been a lot of actually interest in how the protein kinase A pathway, the pathway that I study, which is normally one of the pathways that the cells use to secrete hormones, how that can be upregulated or downregulated during the course of cancer development and progression.
Okay. So are there any particulars? Adrenal cancers are inherited? Of the ones that are inherited, do they strike early or late, more men or women? Are there any propensities to them?
The inherited cancers we tend to see early. The most common type of inherited endocrine cancer is part of a syndrome called Li-Fraumeni syndrome, which is due to mutations in the P53 gene, which is a very well-known oncogene. Tumor suppressor gene. I have to be on point there. And then, as I said, they tend to be seen, relatively earlier in inherited settings than in sporadic group of patients. We know adrenal cancer overall has a female predominance, about 2 to 3 to 1 over women to men. And why that is, that we don't really understand quite yet.
I just had a more general question that came to mind. You mentioned P53. In various cancers, that gene could play a role, right?
Absolutely.
But when a cancer happens, it tends to happen in, at least for what we know, in a specific organ and therefore a specific subset of cell types. But the genes that are getting turned on, at least some of them, obviously exist in all cells. It's just interesting that it happens in, these particular cell types, but yet it's the same set or a similar set of genes that get altered. I wonder what that says about the mechanism of it, If it's beyond random.
I completely agree. I mean, the genes that we study, for example, the R1A gene that I mentioned before, is sort of the same story. It's expressed throughout the body, but patients don't get tumors everywhere. They only get them in a certain subset of tumors. The same thing with P53 and a number of these other tumor suppressor genes. It's a great question that I really wish I had the answer to, because I do get asked that, and me, like everyone else, doesn't have the answer.
I don't know how many types of cancer are there. I guess 100 at least, but has anyone mapped the genes that seem to be involved in the cancer for all types of cancers and looked for the most common overlaps, and then maybe looked for mechanisms on how those genes are, regulated, expressed, epigenetically changed, et cetera, maybe to find clues?
Yeah, so that's actually been done. There's, I'm trying to think, it was a few years ago now, where they sort of, there's been this large effort funded by the NIH called the Cancer Genome Atlas, where they've looked at, I don't know, 20 or 30, so maybe more at this point, cancers, and just sequenced tumors, large numbers of tumors. And so there's a tremendous, very rich database of all this information. And people have tried to do exactly what you just said, which is look for things that are common. But I think, and there are some things that are common, but I think what, at least my impression is, and some of our work that we've done in the laboratory bears this out, is that genes behave very differently in different tissues. Even if they're expressed multiple places, taking a gene out of one place or mutating it in one place can have very different effects from doing the exact same thing in a different tissue. So it's a little bit hard to make those broad generalizations.
Well, I'm sure the effects would be different, but the mechanism by which it is altered may be the same, because it's altering that same stretch of DNA. So maybe it could be traced back in that way. And, I don't know, it'd just be interesting to look at, again, the epigenetics that involve that particular gene, for instance, the P53, across all cancers and across all cell types. I don't know. Yeah, there's a ton more to look at. I'm sure the thought can.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and it's sort of one of these very big and fundamental questions that people stew about, but I don't know anyone's come up with a great way to experimentally try to figure that out.
And in terms of the cancers you look at, has anyone identified like an adrenal microbiome? Have you observed? Has anyone spoken anything about a microbiome of the adrenals and how that interacts with tumors on them?
That's not a topic that's really come up in the adrenal world yet. There wouldn't be a specific microbiome because it's the glands are not exposed to the external environment. But I don't know that anyone's looked at, if you were to do a gut microbiome and see how that correlates with the adrenal glands. Not to my knowledge.
Gotcha. And what about like cell-to-cell signaling? In the adrenals, has anyone looked at like the extracellular vesicles that adrenal cells put out for any clues there on what's going on?
There's been a little bit of work like that, but I think in the adrenal field, it's probably not so subtle. We know that the obviously adrenal glands make hormones. They make a bunch of different hormones depending on, and the adrenal gland, you could think of it as sort of like a sphere where each of the different, or a set of concentric spheres or nesting spheres where each one makes a slightly different hormone. So you can actually, look at cells that are from the outer part of the gland may make different hormones from cells that are closer to the middle and so on.
Okay.
And how those play a role is been very interesting. Actually, there's been a lot of really interesting data probably over the last 2 to 3 years over how does a cell decide when they're going to make one hormone and then they make a different hormone and then make a slightly different hormone as the cells migrate towards the middle of the gland. That seems to happen. And there's been a lot of really interesting molecular dissection by a number of labs here. Not here at my place, but
this may be, I don't know, this may be a really ignorant question, I don't know. But the adrenal glands, the two of them, they sit on top of the kidneys. Are they literally connected to the kidney, through like an extracellular matrix where they're like kind of glued onto them, or how do they interface with the kidney?
Yeah, so the answer is no. They just they just sort of sit there. They don't really have any particular relationship to the kidney other than the kidney and the adrenal glands sort of start in different places, and then during embryogenesis they kind of migrate and bump into each other and sort of stop there. So it's really the fact that they're called the adrenal glands is really just sort of an accident of geography more so than anything else.
Are they connected, the two glands, or are they truly separate?
They're separate.
Okay. So when you see cancers or dysfunction, is it uniform across both of the glands, or is it preferentially in left or right for some reason? And how do they differ?
Yeah. So cancers typically will be one side or the other, and there's not a particular preference. There's a lot of data about maybe one is 55%, the other one is 45%, but I think in the big picture, left and right seem to be about the same. That's in the tumor world. We know there are a number of diseases that affect both glands equally. And in fact, I mentioned before this aldosterone hormone, and if you make too much of that, it causes high blood pressure. Probably about half the people that have that actually have a condition that's often not understood that affects both glands. So we know both glands are overactive and they're not regulated properly because they don't make the right amount of hormone. But that's the clinical observation, and the molecular observation is we know sometimes what causes that, particularly in these very unusual inherited syndromes. But for most people, we don't really know why both glands just start working too hard.
So is it possible to help people where you can take out one of the adrenal glands if let's say it's cancerous, but they can still get along with one? Is that a situation?
Yeah, that's something that happens, pretty commonly in patients that have adrenal tumors. One adrenal gland is enough. You don't need two. So if a patient that has a benign tumor, certainly we'll take out the one with the tumor and leave the other one alone. Patients that have cancers, if we can do the surgery, then we will.
Okay. Then what do you sense is nearing maybe a breakthrough in understanding either treatment or just pure understanding, in the adrenal world?
Well, I think one of the real exciting things in the field is that there's, at least in the adrenal cancer field specifically, is that first of all, I should preface this by saying it's an incredibly rare disease. Literally, about 1 in a million people have the adrenal cancer. So, for any one physician or hospital or group to try to do clinical research studies, it just doesn't work because no one has enough patients. So what's happened over the past maybe 15 to 20 years, the whole international community of people that has interest in adrenal cancer has gotten together to form a international consortium. So we actually have been able to do some of these clinical trials to try to understand how different chemotherapy agents work, which ones are better than other ones. So I think in the big picture, we're definitely making progress. I think with all the molecular testing that's going on, we are certainly getting closer to identifying targets that will work better. It's been a little bit unsatisfying. There's a real lot of excitement about the signaling pathway called IGF-1 receptor, because we know that's overexpressed in a lot of adrenal cancers. So a number of drug companies have developed drugs targeting this, and clinically they've been a little bit disappointing. It may be that there's a subset of tumors that will respond to that, and other ones that need a different combination, or either different therapy or a different combination of therapies. And I think we're not there yet, but we're getting closer.
Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more?
So that's a good question.
Yeah, at least find access to some papers maybe that you put out, or just get a more sense of the research that's going on.
I mean, I always say clinicaltrials.gov is a great site to find out what active clinical trials are ongoing. There's a number of sort of patient advocacy, patient support groups that are actually have been quite helpful. There's, I think the site's called adrenalcorticalcarcinoma.com. That's run by a spouse of a patient who had the disease and ended up dying, and he's been a really good support person. I think the Endocrine Society and the Hormone Society websites have good information about adrenal cancer and where the research is going on these days. So those are kind of good places to start.
Okay, very good. Well, Lawrence, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. It's been great talking to you.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com.